In our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, we have come to the close of the text, and Sri Aurobindo's commentary also is coming to its closure. There is one more chapter after this one where he presents a kind of a summary and a conclusion as a last word. But this closure is so significant, although limited to just a few verses, that this alone Sri Aurobindo spends 2 full pages to dwell upon for its deeper import. You will recall in our discussion last time the big picture of the Kena, how it begins with these 4 questions that relate to our human mental experience, seeking the source of our power of thought, speech, sense experience and life. And it therefore leads us to the recognition that there is a mind of our mind, life of our life, speech of our speech and sense of our sense. A kind of a super life, a higher grade of experience and living, of which our mental life is a degradation, limitation and reflection. And then it teaches us how to rise to that, to begin to live in that here, in the world. And in the 3rd section of the Kena, through the parable of the gods, it uses the power of symbolism and the parable to show on multiple levels the evolutionary movement of this ascent. In the individual evolution across lives, in the collective evolution in the entire cosmos, and then our individual transition right now as we are to the next. All these 3 contexts are simultaneously dealt with when we go through the symbolism of the parable. And in this 4th chapter of the Kena, the mind which has been prepared is now brought to the revelation of that, the divine, the eternal. Who leads it? It's the Divine Mother herself, the Divine Shakti. And it is she who is teaching us all the rest that follows. In the 2 verses that we last saw, describing the nature of the transition, when our consciousness breaks out of its limitations, when our mind opens out to the divine consciousness, the transition is described as through a series of lightnings. And in our own self, the thought begins to dwell on that by the familiarity by which the mind seems to attain to that. And then there is a continual remembrance which takes place on a higher peak of the mind's awareness. In these 2 verses, there is a significant suggestion in the vocabulary used. Now, you will recall both the Isha Upanishad and the Kena Upanishad are very close to the Vedic vocabulary and thought. And so whenever you see a word used which is Vedic in its origin, we have to look at its deeper sense from the Vedic tradition. In the verse which said, "Now this is the indication of that, as is this flash of the lightning upon us, or as is this falling of the eyelids, so in that which is of the gods." And this describes the whole transition of our nature. But here the word used of the gods is adhidaivatam. In the next verse, then that which is of the self, as the motion of this mind seems to attain to that, and by it afterwards the will in the thought continually remembers it. This describes the transition of our individual awareness, awakening beyond mind into that which is of the divine consciousness. And there, the word used for of the self is adhyatmam. Now these two words, adhidaivatam and adhyatmam, straight away reveal to us, remind us of the triple Vedic vocabulary. And I will dwell on this briefly, so we will capture the big picture that these two words bring in their suggestion. There are three phrases used: adhi bhautik, adhi daivik and adhyatmik. Adhi, of the nature of; bhautik, the five elements, bhuta, substances or essential elements. So of the nature of the elements or belonging to the domain of the five elements. This is adhi bhautik. This is one domain of experience in the world. The next is adhi daivik, of the nature of or the domain of the devas. Recall devas, gods is a loose translation, a bad translation. Deva comes from the sense of light, light beings. Div is the root. So of the domain of the light beings, of the powers of the divine operating in the world, representing the powers of the divine light. This is the second domain of the cosmic experience. And then the third is adhi atmik or adhyatmik, when you join the word, of the nature or of the domain or the domain of the Atman, the self, the one. And this is where you transcend form, you transcend all limitation, you enter the reality. In that reality, though, you are not in a monotone. It is a rich, infinite potential held in the oneness of the self. So on all three levels you are experiencing multiplicity as well as unity. In the lowest you have only multiplicity with the unity hidden. In the highest you have the dominance of unity with the multiplicity hidden, so to say, waiting to be deployed. In between the two, in the domain of the light beings, the gods, we have the oneness moving into multiplicity, but where the oneness is not yet lost, it is not yet forgotten. The gods know their underlying oneness, but they operate in their separation, in their multiplicity for the purpose of the play. And then in the lowest, in the domain of the elements, we have only forms constructed out of processes and pieces. The oneness is so deeply hidden, you can even not see it. Now you will recall the discussion of the five elements which we had many chapters ago, when Sri Aurobindo described how the one force, the divine force ultimately, one single force of consciousness goes through 5 degrees of self-modification, which makes for 5 grades of experience of substance or form. Only in the 5th do we have stable form, rigid, as we see in matter. You can collide and it does not break. If you go one step before the rigidity applies, you have the fluidity of form, as you see with the flow of liquid, where liquids are distinct, but they mix because they do not have a rigid form to keep them together. The water you pour takes the shape of the glass. It has its character of solidity, but it has not the rigidity of the 5th element. You go back one step, the domain of the first appearance of form, the working of the principle of Agni, and you have all the electrical phenomena, you have all the means by which nature attaches form or attaches energy to create the appearance of stable form. In the subatomic particles we see this. There is as if the appearance of form, but the subatomic particle is unstable, undergoing change. By binding them together in certain combinations, the unstable movement is made to repeat in a stable form. And so this is the domain of Agni. We go higher up one step, even that form is gone. You have the pure operation of force, and that is the force that you experience in terms of modern physics as electric, magnetic, gravitational and other forces. And that is the domain of Vayu. And finally there is the Akasha, which is the domain of pure vibration. So from one consciousness, one force, undergoing a modification of vibrational interrelation, undergoing modification of attraction and repulsion, undergoing modification of formation, fluid stability and then rigid stability. We have 5 degrees corresponding to the degrees of self-modification, which in the ancient Vedic science were described as the 5 elemental states. Bhuta being elemental, which is the basis of the whole Vedic knowledge and the Vedic technology even and science. So this term, adhibhautik, is all that belongs to this 5-fold process of formation, which means everything that we experience here. What presides over the 5-fold process is the working of the gods. Now the gods themselves are not formed of this 5-fold process. They lead the 5-fold process. They guide the 5-fold process. They work inside the process and make it effective. And so the domain of the gods is inherently free of this 5-fold formation, and therefore they are not constructed by pieces being joined. They are oneness extended outward as power, as energy, as action, as qualities of consciousness, but operating in infinite domain of the whole universe. They are, if we may use a crude analogy of modern physics, they are the laws which make for the physical processes. The processes of physics belong to the 5-fold adhibhautik domain in the 5 elements. But what makes for the law, which makes for the process, is the power that is universal, and those would correspond to the gods. But still, they do something. They work, they act, and between themselves they are different, they are in separation. They can even enter in conflict because their actions are different. And the third step is the adhyatmic, the domain of self, where all the gods unite in the oneness of self, no conflict, no position, all is oneness manifesting in infinite multiplicity with perfect harmony, perfect alignment, completely in spontaneous, fluid harmony, effortless. Now this domain of self, domain of the gods, are the two which are being referred to. We have begun from the domain of mind and body, which was the adhibhautik, and the Upanishad has taught us to ascend through the domain of the gods to the oneness of the Lord. It taught us by pointing to 2 practices or 2 focal points. And the first was that of it which is you. That you have to think. And the second was that of it which is in the gods, in the working of the gods in nature. That is what you have to think out. And by concentration on these 2 things, it taught us how to rise beyond mind into this supra-mental life and experience. Being there, now we are being brought to the final revelation. And we now reread what we had taken up last time. In the next verse, we have the culmination of the teaching of the Upanishad, the result of the great transcendence which it has been setting forth, and afterwards the description of the immortality to which the souls of knowledge attain when they pass beyond the mortal status. Now, two things are happening. We as individual souls are ascending to this, and at the same time, in our psychological nature, the gods and their working is also ascending. The gods are undergoing a transfiguration, transformation, even as our consciousness is being transformed. And so this is the culmination when the two unite and we join into the source, and from there we live. What is it that we see? It declares that Brahman is, in its very nature, that delight, tad vanam. Vana, he explains, is the Vedic word for delight or delightful. And tad vanam means therefore the transcendent delight, the all blissful ananda of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman from which all existences are born. And so here we are coming to something very interesting. Recall earlier when we met the word that, and we met it 5 times. In the very first part of the Kena, when it was teaching us to rise through our existing human experience to that which is behind it. And it said in verse 4, that which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. So you look at your power of expression. You're about to speak and express something. Before even you have expressed in words, there is something which is formulated within you. Perhaps as a thought, perhaps as an impulse to express. Well, even the thought would be an expression of the word from the Vedic sense, because it is a form, it is an articulation. So stand back behind the form of the thought, the impulse which grew to become thought. And in this way you step back until you come to that by which the expression takes place. And you come to an essential power of expression. That, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And this pattern, know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here, is repeated 5 times. The first time with speech, the second time with the mind. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought. So in the power of thought you go back to that essential power by which thinking becomes possible. An essential awareness, even essential poise of knowledge, which is already pre-existent before you can think out. And know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. The third was that which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing. So that is what you follow. So you are seeing something, you see flower. By what power of perception does your sight of the flower take place? There is an essential perception behind the form of the seeing. Even a person born blind has a power of visualization. They may not have a physical sense of the world and its forms, but still the power to conceive and form in the mind, give a higher grade of visual form, is already there innate. And it is to that we come, and behind that a little. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. Verse 7, the same thing was with the hearing. That which hears not with the ear, that by which the ear's hearing is heard. So the essential power of hearing, but that does not need ears to hear. That essential sight does not need physical eyes to see. And that essential mind does not need the thinking process of mind to know. It can know directly. And in the same way, that speech does not need thought or word to articulate itself. It can put its power and will itself. The fifth was that which breathes not with the breath, that by which the life breath is led forward in its paths. Know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And this is the life, essential life force, which can operate even in the physical, biological and energetic, pranic life energy is paused. It is that which can sustain through these, it is that which makes these effective. If that is withdrawn, all these collapse. And these 5 were given to us with the pointer of that and not this. So when we now come to this word, the name of that is that delight. We have to draw by resonance all this prior knowledge and preparation. That and not this. And if the Upanishad has taken pains to say, seek that and not this, it means there is a double movement in the seeking. There has to be a part of our being which seeks the higher, but there's another part which deliberately disengages from the past and the habitual inheritance of our nature. You have to make a conscious double effort, one of rejection even as there is the aspiration. And we know how much importance Sri Aurobindo gives to this. And so this double movement now is implied the moment it uses the word that. The name of that is that delight. As that delight, one should follow after it. It does not need to say, not this. All that is there, implied. As that delight, one should follow after this. Now recall all the journey of our exploration of the Kena leading us step by step. Not once did this word delight come in. It has come in only now, when there is about to be the full transfiguration of the gods, the transformation of the nature, and the full liberation of our consciousness in the divine. And at that point it introduces this term, because any prior introduction of this would be premature. We cannot know the nature of the delight unless we have come to this poise on the brink of the oneness of the divine. Anything you experienced before is not it, is not even similar to it. You see, the human mind, when it takes this term delight, when it tries to conceive of the experience of delight, what does it do? It takes the existing human state of happiness or enjoyment and then exaggerates it. Just as if we thought of what would be the divine mind like, our image would be, as we see often in certain forms of cinema or in science fiction, somebody who has 100% brain power operative, or the brain is plugged into a supercomputer and can it process now 1,000,000 times faster, 1,000,000,000 times faster, 1,000,000,000,000 times faster. But it's still the same essential process of taking information, processing, building new information, giving back. There's an interesting movie which is fascinating for the exploration of the theme, and it was, do you remember the name? A girl who is made to Lucy, the name of the movie is Lucy. A girl is made to carry some drugs in her stomach, and somehow the bag leaks and the drugs enter her system. And what they do is they amplify her full mind power and brain power. And so through the movie, as the movie goes, her powers of consciousness begin to expand and open. She has extraordinary abilities, not only of access of knowledge, but of direct action of mind on matter. But the most important, she is now able to free herself from the body, enter into a state of what is visualized as cosmic consciousness, perceive and travel across time and space in the past and the future, link across all these experiences, and at the end, as her gift to humanity, because she knows her brain is going to be burnt out, she gathers all this knowledge of time and space articulates it as if through a machine which is built around her body, and then gifts it in a single hard disk to humanity. And that's a bit of an anticlimax. Somehow the assumption is all that knowledge can be reduced to a representation in a hard disk. The very beginning of the Vedic teaching starts with the truth cannot be expressed in words, cannot be reduced to symbols, cannot be fully articulated by mind and ideas, because it is inherently supra-mental. It can be articulated, it can be expressed, but in parts, in pieces. And inherent to the reduction of parts and pieces is falsification. So anything you express in the act of expressing, when you reduce and narrow it, it is falsified. But it is representing something of the truth. And to the extent that it represents the truth, it is true. So you can take any statement in human formulation, mental formulation, and you can prove that it's right. You can equally prove that it is wrong in a different context, in a certain time and space and circumstance. So it's a useful exercise even to train the mind. Take a statement, show how it is wrong, show where it is right, and then take its opposite and show where that is wrong, where this is right. Combine this now to a more comprehensive statement, show where that is right and then where that is wrong. You can keep on playing unendingly. You will never reach the truth, which inherently requires you to break out of this process of mind, form of mind, thought, representation and word. And so this idea is so deep right at the beginning of the Veda. The only way you can experience that truth is to enter it in this faculty of your consciousness which is just above mind. But it is there, and because it is there we can all experience it. Having reached it, having experienced the truth, you can still use the vehicle of your mind to articulate and express in terms of words and other means. And so the hard disk would still be a limited expression, but it would be falsified in the very act of expressing. And this idea is so deep. This applies now not only to all the things that the Kena has been leading us to through the mind, the senses, the life energy and the speech. It's leading us to that. But now, having come to this poise of consciousness where we are ready, where our consciousness is liberated, we can now experience something of the oneness and its infinity. Then only it presents the word delight. Because that's when you are able to know it or glimpse it. Anything before would be a distortion, a perversion, a parody. And this idea we have to fall back upon, that we're dealing with a level of reality which the lower powers of perception and senses cannot access. But as we ascend, we awaken into powers of perception which can access. So this is a crucial element of the Vedic thought which Sri Aurobindo articulates very clearly in terms that the modern mind can understand. Reality is of many levels. Our power of knowing it is also on many levels. As we ascend in consciousness, our access to knowledge, our power of cognition, of knowing, itself undergoes a change with the change of consciousness and develops into a completely different way of knowing, which belongs properly to that domain. And this ascent of our power of knowledge takes place also in a continuum, even as the ascent of consciousness takes place in a continuum. And to that we may add equally the power of action, not only of knowledge. The power of action also grows in this ascent in the continuum. As we ascend in this higher grade of knowledge and will, not only the consciousness is different, but consciousness has other powers, greater powers, which do not exist on the lower levels. Now, just as our life is a pale reflection of the divine life. Our senses are a pale reflection of the divine sense, and our mind is a reflection of that power of knowledge. So too we may say our joy, our happiness is a pale reflection of that delight. We could say that. But the truth would be, even our suffering, even our unhappiness, even our pain is a pale reflection of that. All sensation, all emotion, all absorption of experience and what comes with it is a pale reflection of that. Because the nature of delight is common to them all. Even when in pain, even when in unhappiness, something within us is fascinated by the experience itself, and it enjoys the delight, the sap, the rasa of everything. There is a morbid curiosity sometimes in another's pain. Why? Because there's a novel aspect to it, something to learn, and an enjoyment even in that learning. But all of these are distortions, and equally distorted. The human happiness and excitement and enjoyment are all equally distortions. Sri Aurobindo explains how, he gives this example in the Life Divine, that if you take the experience of sensation and the sensation of pleasure, it can increase until the point where the system begins to break down. As long as the system can contain it, pleasure can increase. At the point where the system breaks down, it becomes pain. And if that power of the system is increased, if the vitality is boosted, the same thing which was pain earlier can become pleasurable. And so when you are, for example, fighters, while wrestling, while boxing, playing football, in the heat of the energy of the play and the vitality of the play, they bump into each other, they get scratches, they get injuries. At that moment, it is all fun. You do not even experience the pain unless it becomes extreme. Something breaks. But otherwise, you do not even experience pain. It is almost pleasurable. And afterwards, when the heightened excitement drops, suddenly now my muscles are aching, the scratch is burning, and I have a headache from the blows of the boxing, and your system is now on a lower level of capacity. The experience of the delight can be had only by a consciousness and a power which is infinite, because the delight belongs to the domain of infinity. Inherently, the human biology cannot experience it because it is finite inherently. But when the consciousness awakens and the consciousness is liberated from this narrowness, in its infinity, it can begin to experience the true nature of the divine delight. And then it can begin to reflect that inside the human system. As the human body itself, although the form of the body may be finite, the body consciousness begins to share in the infinity of the divine consciousness. It too can begin to contain and hold the divine delight. Sri Aurobindo refers to this experience, but it belongs to a domain where the physical consciousness itself has been sufficiently divinized. Even in his detailed writings in the Synthesis of Yoga, he mentions, describing the work that needs to be done on the physical consciousness, he says that will be kept for later. And of course, he never covers it in the Life Divine, it's in the Synthesis of Yoga itself. In one of his letters, he refers to this and says he had intended to write many more chapters in the Synthesis, which he did not have time to write later. But there he would have described how the supramental consciousness must come down through various degrees of self-limitation, what kinds of difficulties it must overcome, and all those things. But already what he had written is enough that it will take us many lifetimes to make perfect. But in his record of yoga, he does describe this, where even his physical consciousness begins to hold the divine delight. And one of the forms that it takes is, in every human experience, there is the touch of the infinite, and there is the touch of the divine beloved. Even a scorpion sting is the caress of the divine beloved. He walks on the floor barefoot at midday on the stone floor, which becomes extremely hot, and he walks on it, and there is a soothing, a joyous sensation, nothing of the discomfort which would be normal to the physical body. But all of these we are pointing to because they represent a minimum requirement of a consciousness which has experienced infinity and can live in infinity. And therefore the Kena brings this at the last stage. It could just as well have started right at the beginning and said, well, you want to realize the divine, well, know that as the divine delight. What would you do? The first thing you would do is have a wrong idea, translate or exaggerate the idea of the delight into some human terms and go off track. One can speak of it only when that basic liberation and purification has taken place. So now it declares that Brahman is in its nature that delight, tadvanam. So that here tells us that against this, which seek that and not this, which men follow after here. That is implied the moment it speaks of that. But what is the verse? Verse 6. The name of that is that delight. As that delight one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. Now we will explore this further in the Sanskrit vocabulary also. And the first word which we will see, the name of that, nama in Sanskrit. And again that brings to us a suggestion from the Vedic tradition, where repeatedly there are two terms used, nama and rupa, the name and the form. And both are considered to be the domain of fragmented consciousness. When you go beyond fragmentation, how do you go in the oneness? What form can you experience? What name would you give to it? Because after all oneness is identical in its essence. And yet you can name experiences, but the name are not exclusive. You can perceive forms, but the forms are not exclusive. Here they are exclusive. If this is one object and that is another, well, they clash. One cannot take place of the other. They are separate. In the higher domains, that exclusivism becomes less and less, until in the oneness of the divine consciousness, they are only aspects of each other. The same ocean puts out a small wave, puts out a big wave. The small wave is the whole ocean expressing smallness. The big wave is the whole ocean representing large movement. And the small wave meeting the big wave is the whole ocean meeting the whole ocean. And yet you can say small wave, big wave, and give it particular qualities. But this term, nama and rupa, immediately points us to something which is belonging to the domain of form and limitation. Name suggests the way mind perceives, conceives or reduces. The name is the form that the mind can give in thought. And rupa, form, is the way we would associate with the physical form. So there is the physical form of flower, and you may have many flowers. And then there is the name that the mind gives to the flower of its quality, or simply an abstract term, flower. Now if I ask you to visualize flower, the mind can only reduce to a specific flower. Try to visualize the essential idea that is just the word flower, not to a specific flower. And suddenly your mind has a problem. It needs to reduce to form in order to be able to grasp the idea. If you go back beyond form to just pure name, flower, you don't have a picture anymore. But you can hold a pure idea of flower without picture, and that's possible. Now this poise is the pure nama, without rupa, pure flower, no forms, of which this is one rupa, that is another rupa, that is another form. But pure flower is a generic, archetypal, pure concept. Similarly, you could speak of freedom. What does it mean to you to be free? And each one will come up with their own story of what it's free. Someone who is in jail will say, I am free of jail. And a teenager will say, I am free of my parents. Now I can do what I want. And another person in business will say, I am free of debt. A country under insubordination will say, we are now free politically. All of these are forms of freedom. But can you conceive of pure freedom without form? And it's more difficult than flower. A pure idea of what is freedom, and dissolve any form that comes to your mind. You'll find after a while there is a state of consciousness, an idea which represents a state of consciousness, that is freedom. If you had that state of consciousness within you, well, you would be free, even if your body is imprisoned. Isn't it? Your consciousness would be free. So mind is capturing the nama, which is the name of freedom, which encases to the pure freedom of consciousness a vehicle of thought, but free of form. Why is this so important? And what is the sense of the Kena Upanishad telling us? The name of that is that delight, Tadvanam. And you will refer again to the Vedic tradition, which says, just as form represents a truth and therefore carries the power of the truth, so too the name represents the truth and carries the power of the truth. The form, because it's already rigidified and on a lower level, has less of the power of the truth, whereas the name, being closer to the truth, less bound to form and limitation, carries a greater power of the truth. And this principle is used in the Vedic tradition to transmit spiritual experience through the name. In fact, the whole formulation of the Veda is nothing but spiritual experience which is supramental, beyond mind, beyond words, beyond form, now articulated in the most natural vibrational form that is possible in the world, in mind and then in matter. The Sanskrit language itself is the direct translation of a consciousness experience into the domain of vibration. First as idea, as nama, pure idea beyond form, and then the same vibration entering domain of form and material form, taking this specific sound. Now you see what the Veda is teaching us here. The name of that is Tadvanam. Meaning when that turns to manifesting itself in the mind, this is the name it takes. And like the text of the Veda, like the power of the Veda, it has the power to transmit. And this is what it's pointing to. By giving us a name, it is also giving us a link point by which we can hold it and even express or transmit it. Of course, it is at the level which is pure nama. There is no rupa here. You have to bring the mind to that poise to know that delight in pure name. This idea, of course, extends into the more gross form with this sense that when you speak the name, you activate the power, you activate the energy behind it. It was used in the magical and occult traditions, where certain terms were kept secret, certain terms were kept overt, and you could use the overt language in common usage, and the secret language or the secret name you would use only at the time when you wanted to manifest the power, at the time of the incantation or the invocation of the power. Even among people, you see, there is the ordinary name and the initiated name. And this is the idea behind it. It is your deeper spiritual identity that that initiated name represents. And so often in the magical tradition, for example, the initiated name would be spoken only in the sacred space, where the name would not be corrupted and it was held in its purity. And the act of calling someone by their name was as if invoking or reinforcing that power or that consciousness that they represented. And you see how this takes the form practically in human life when we name a child. In the cruder form where it takes place in India now, they will look at your horoscope, and based on certain arrangements of the planets and their associated sound character, they will say the first letter of the name should be such and such. And then they don't care what the rest is. Why? Because this is one of the aspects of the esoteric tradition, that the greatest power is in the first syllable. So you will see in the Sanskrit language, the first syllable literally defines the direction of the word. The second syllable modifies. The third syllable, if at all, makes a further finer, specific mental form to it. But the first is what sets the direction. We are going east, that's it. Or you're going west, or north, or south. The direction being set, the rest is only a question of narrowing and specifying. So the astrology gives you this particular focus. This should be the first letter. And then the parents, grandparents, and so on will find a sound that they like, a word, a meaning that they like. But notice what it does to the child. When you know that your name means this, automatically this particular quality begins to take a greater priority in your consciousness. By aligning yourself consciously with it, you even grow into that quality. The name shapes the direction of your consciousness. Now, if you're conscious of it, you may consciously feel it. If you're not conscious of it, it's the one word that you hear from everybody, isn't it? It's the one word in the whole of the vocabulary of humanity which is your favorite. Everyone likes to hear their name. And it's how the universe knows you. The universe speaks to you first by addressing you with this term. And what does it do? It amplifies in you that quality and turns your whole consciousness in that direction. And this is so important. I've seen often when we meet children who, when they say their name, you are quite sure they don't know its meaning. You ask them, what does it mean? And they will say, no, we don't. And when you tell them the meaning, they say, and there's this whole illumination. And afterwards, you make certain associations linking their behavior with their name, and they say, oh yes, that makes a lot of sense. It's as if you just discovered this was you, and now you begin to accept and recognize. And so the power of the name is in this. In the act of giving a name, you have got the power in the way closest to such a possibility. And so here, when the Upanishad brings you to the culmination, it gives you a handle with which to catch that. It could have said, continue in this way until you merge into that delight. Well, the goal of this whole journey is the merging and living in that delight. But it tells you name. The name of that is that delight, and there's a purpose to it. So this is something worth dwelling upon. Taddha tadvanam nama. Tadvanam is the name of that. And then, as that delight, one should follow after it. Having given you that hold, connection, a point of link, now you must continue to follow after it as that delight. Now remember, again, when you approach the divine, it is infinite potential, it is all possibilities and all powers. You could have said as knowledge, or as omniscient, as omniscience, or as omnipotence and all power, or as all light, or all peace, or anything. But it specifically points to delight. Why? And this is what Sri Aurobindo points to in his commentary when he mentions the all blissful Ananda of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman. So the Brahman can be known in many ways, many aspects, many powers, including all these of peace and light and knowledge and power. But delight is its highest. So the highest Brahman is the all blissful Ananda. And so this points us to this highest Brahman. And what the Taittiriya says, we will be taking up next time. But now we understand why Sri Aurobindo mentions the Taittiriya, because the delight is the highest. And now, having given us this link, the Kena says, as that delight, one should follow after it. Now, you will recall again, one should follow after it has this resonance when in the verses earlier, it had given this vocabulary. Know that to be the Brahman and not this, which meant follow after here. So the following is the movement which we have turned upwards, and now we continue to follow after it there. The third component of this verse, he who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. So what happens when you follow after it in this, by this name, as that delight when you follow? He who knows that, he could have said, but he who knows that as this, as that delight, towards him verily all existences yearn. In the word Sanskrit vocabulary, the term used, he who so knows that, has the particular nuance of meaning he who so knows that alone. There is the sense of exclusivism. When you know the divine as that alone, towards him verily all existences yearn. And the word for existences in the Bhutani has not only the sense of all existences but all beings equally. And so Sri Aurobindo's commentary now elaborates what happens as the being turns to that delight. Sri Aurobindo says, it is as this transcendent delight that the Brahman must be worshipped and sought. It is this beatitude, therefore, which is meant by the immortality of the Upanishads. Remember, all the time the Upanishads were speaking of the realization of the immortal. And what will be the result of knowing and possessing Brahman as the supreme Ananda? It is that towards the knower and possessor of the Brahman is directed the desire of all creatures. In other words, he becomes a center of the divine delight, shedding it on all the world and attracting all to it as to a fountain of joy and love and self-fulfillment in the universe. Now, why should the Upanishad focus on this idea that all beings are attracted to that, to the one who knows this? Is it that you become more glorified? Now you're famous, now you're becoming a guru to whom people of the world will come? Nowhere in the text of the Kena is any such the intention. The intention is to be liberated into the divine living on earth. So why this idea that all come to you when you know the Brahman as such? And what Sri Aurobindo points here is this: it is a sense of fulfillment in life, in matter. The coming of the whole universe, it's as if the whole universe now leans to this center of light. Because all the time the whole universe has been seeking for, struggling for the realization of the divine as Ananda. Everything in life, through all the happinesses and through all the sufferings, through all the pains and pleasures, everything is yearning for the divine bliss. And so if something of that bliss now is formulated, manifested through a vehicle here in the world, then it's as if the whole universe leans towards that because it is seeking that. You are fulfilling the purpose of the universe. The universe is fulfilled in you. And it is this that the Upanishad is pointing to when it says all beings are drawn to it. Sri Aurobindo uses the same idea in his writings in the Synthesis of Yoga or in the Life Divine, when he says that the goal is not a liberation into some beyond, but it is the realization and the manifestation of the divinity here, so that each one of us becomes as if a generator and a radiator of that divine consciousness. To bring it here and manifest it. And naturally when that is manifested, since the whole universe is yearning for that, it turns to the source. Now it does not mean they may even know the person. The person may be entirely unknown to the universe, but the universe will feel the delight now close, in matter, and yearn towards it and draw from it. Such was the nature of the manifestation of many great avatars in the past. And in this incarnation that we have known as Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, the very presence on earth of a being who embodies that changes the whole destiny of humanity and begins a new future. But towards such a direction and such a fulfillment, this effort will lead, and that's what the Upanishad is pointing to. Now, having completed this idea and this paragraph of Sri Aurobindo's commentary, we will revisit next time some of the details. First, the reference to the Taittiriya, which needs some exploration, and then the reference of the delight by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. And so these are three different concepts, and each needs an elaboration, and we will discover there the true nature of delight, not just as something which is transcendent there in its revealed glory, but which is also concealed here in the world, just as everything divine is concealed here, and how it guides secretly through human experience in the midst of all things. And that will be our exploration. Through there, the Taittiriya will show us the highest form of the Brahman, as well as its play here in the lower expression or play of Brahman. So we see the big picture, the whole movement of the Kena Upanishad culminating in this grand revelation. And it's one sentence, but this one sentence now must seep backwards into everything which was earlier taught by the Kena. And you will see in the light of this, everything undergoes a shift and a deeper insight and a deeper force even in what it reveals to us. We can read this one sentence, one verse, and then briefly meditate on it. Tadha Tadvanam Nama. The name of that is that delight. As that delight one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn.